So here's what greets you upon opening a REMI product. Nice tile-based interface, and we have what we at REMI like to call a top-down, bottom-up approach. So top-down, things that happen at the regional level are influenced by what's happening at the national level. Now here the distinction is sort of blurred because we're looking at a number of regions that taken together make up the entire nation. But just to show what I mean, we can take a look at the regional forecast here. Oops, bringing that window back. And just taking a skim, this is a forecast made in the time after COVID. So we can see that depression in employment. We can see the blip in GDP and output for 2020, and then predicting trends going off into the future. Let's also take a look at those regional purchasing coefficients just to get a sense of what they mean, what they can change between different industries. So here we have the regional purchasing coefficients by industry, looking at the national level. So we can see that about 90% of US consumption is met within the United States. And we can actually rank it to see which industries see the most and which industries see the least. So it makes sense that there are a lot of things like mining, transportation, accommodation, museums, that these are very location specific and they can only be met within the United States. You can't import a museum or historical site. And then as we scroll down, we see some other things that are still very localized. We see government spending, we see construction, performing arts, legal services. Again, these are all very nation specific. But then if we flip it the other way, so now we're going least to greatest, we see like audio and equipment manufacturing, apparel, fishing. These actually seem to demonstrate that there are a lot of imports into the country in order to meet demand. And so what we've done is that we've taken the regional purchasing coefficient for each industry at the national level, and then multiplied that by government demand for that industry. And we can actually see what the changes are here. So let's take a look at the pessimistic scenario. This is 50% of imports turn into domestic sales. So these changes here are done in 2012 dollars. As a note, the sum that we're working with here comes out to about $25 billion for this 50% scenario. We can actually, if we take an edit, we can see which are the biggest and which are the least. So biggest here means that either or the government has a large demand for it, or there is a very low regional purchasing coefficient. So some of the biggest changes here, so motor vehicle manufacturing, communications equipment, aerospace product manufacturing. And this looks promising because this is a measure that is designed to help American manufacturing. And it looks like a lot of the spending that we're doing as a government, or as a lot of the government procurement that comes as imports, is manufacturing. So there is some direction or some suggestion that this is going in the right direction. So $13 billion for motor vehicle manufacturing, almost $1 billion for other electronics. And then looking at the bottom of the list, either this means that a lot of the government is already self-supplied, or the government does very little spending on this. So railroad stock, beverages, architecture, and metals. So again, it's either local supply or, and both, very low government spending. So we took each of these for 10 years and we shifted them to be from imports to domestic sales. So it's a one-to-one swap from imports to domestic sales, and we can actually just take a look at the results. Oops, let's find our favorites menu. So as you would expect, this tends to be a pretty positive change for the United States. So let's actually just take a look at this graph. So output is the orange line, GDP is the blue line, and the difference between output and GDP is that output includes intermediate goods, whereas GDP does not, but they'll both move in the same direction. With this pessimistic scenario at 50%, GDP rises by about 0.5% at its peak, GDP rises by about 0.42% at its peak, and then gently tails off afterwards. Employment also works in much the same way. So, 0.34% increase in employment, or in absolute terms for the nation, about 650,000 jobs at its highest. But and this draws in additional labor force, and this makes sense. As production of certain goods increases, you're going to be dragging in a lot more workers. Now, as we see, there is definitely a tail or a drop-off that happens as this happens over time, and part of that is the general equilibrium effects of the model. There tends to be a reversion to something that's market clearing, and so the response we're getting here, as we increase production in certain sectors, increase employment, increase income, we're also increasing consumption, we're also increasing demand for intermediate goods. And so what we're doing that sort of has a chilling effect on this is that we're raising domestic prices, in this case by about 0.1%. So that's part of the reason why, in spite of this increase, there's a little bit of a drag back down to earth. Now, what this actually isn't a change of, by the way, is how much the government is forecasted to be importing. That actually remains pretty constant, is actually and ever so slightly increasing over time. So it's the price increase that is doing a lot of the work here. And we can see which industries are going to see the biggest benefits from this. So right now we're looking at differences in employment. So this is relative to our baseline of where the United States makes no change at all. And let's take a look. So 2021 is when we first enact this policy. And we can see some of the biggest benefits in terms of number of jobs are construction, retail, wholesale trade. So some of what may be, and then motor vehicle manufacturing, computer design systems. So some of this is very clearly industries we've hit. We noticed that a lot of manufacturing industries, motor vehicle manufacturing in particular, were some of the biggest beneficiaries of this proposed change. What's happening for retail, what's happening for construction as well, is that there's a knock-on effect of when people are earning money in the industries that directly benefit, they are spending that money elsewhere and supporting other industries as well. If we look at percent change, things seem to be a little more in line with what we would expect at first blush. So let's find the biggest percent changes. Motor vehicle manufacturing sees a huge increase as well, 7% increase in employment, motor vehicle parts. So lots of manufacturing is happening around here. Foundries, for iron and steel and metal work, that in theory are some of the most directly targeted in Biden's executive order, see a 2% increase in employment. Iron and steel mills also see a 1.4% increase in employment. So these are benefits. These are definitely working the way that is intended, but given how sizable these changes are, or given how sizable the policy changes, it's up to us, it's up to the Biden administration to evaluate, is this producing sufficient results? But what we can say is that if we look at the map, and here we have our 8 BEA economic regions, we're seeing the benefits are still working, are still targeted towards what they're aiming at. So we're looking at the Rust Belt, excuse me, a home of American manufacturing, and we see even this pessimistic scenario, a 0.7% increase in GDP. Other industries as well, the West Coast, the American South see some benefits as well. And if we look at it in absolute terms, rather than percent change, we see like the absolute benefits still accruing to the Rust Belt, the Great Lakes region, but also the American South, and then a lot in terms of GDP for the West Coast. So that's kind of what like in summary, we see like a 0.5% increase in GDP, 0.3% increase in employment. If we look at the 100% scenario, so this is pie in the sky, absolute dream for this policy would be to have it increase by 100%. So everything the government did was purchased domestically. And we can see the results are sizable. We see maybe a 0.8% increase in GDP. As far as employment goes, a 0.7% increase in employment. And then if we look at the industries, we see pretty sizable increases in employment there as well. So if we rank it again, 14% increase in motor vehicle manufacturing, 4.5% increase in foundries. Although if we look at it in terms of absolutes, in terms of differences rather than just percent differences, then things are, a little less severe. So it's economics. It depends on how you look at it. So iron and steel mills, again, some of the most explicitly targeted industries in this proposal see 2,300 jobs, and per this model. And so it begs the question, is the juice worth the squeeze on this one? So that wraps it up for the demo. We've shown what it looks like to, what happens if imports become domestic sales, and what that's going to do to prices and employment in different industries. But it does raise some questions for future analysis. So we're seeing these gains in GDP and employment, and that's all well and good, but are we looking at the full picture here? And let's see if I can bring this back to full screen. There we go. So part of it is that we might be making really large assumptions, best case scenarios, for how much money is actually in play, between costs, between like actual cost difference between the waivers and exemptions, and the fact that the price difference here is not a huge, we're not increasing the price difference or the price penalty for foreign goods by that much. Not all of that $50 billion is actually going to come into play. Maybe only a small sliver of it is. But if we do, we start getting into weird questions about what is the actual effect going to be, because best case scenario, the price difference between American and foreign goods is small, but there's a huge redirection anyway towards American manufacturing. So we increase output without increasing government spending by that much. But on the other hand, if the price difference is small to begin with, then how much were people not buying American, or how much was the federal government not buying American to begin with? And then so we're increasing government spending, we're increasing government administration costs as we have to vet, well, how much is 55% made in America? And that might come in the form of decreased government spending elsewhere. It might come in the form of increased taxes to serve a growing national debt at some point in the future. So this isn't just straight benefit. And then, of course, there are other more political costs. There could be diplomatic retaliations from countries that are unhappy with an explicit effort to redirect consumption away from them back into the United States, and might respond in kind. They might impose tariffs, they might redirect their own government procurement and decrease American output. So what we're seeing here is that even our best case scenarios, we're generating small changes, and we're still, even without taking into account additional costs, both from domestic sources and from abroad. And so what we want to leave you with is that, hey, there is a lot that goes into trade policy, and economic considerations will never be the only considerations behind trade policy. But Remy as a software gives you the tools to start assessing what those consequences might be in terms of boiling down something that is very complicated into something that is more manageable and modelable, to produce results, to be able to compare, to be able to predict what is going to happen before a large sweeping policy gets put into place.